What's going on, guys? Noob Repair back again. I'm joined by my good friend Eric.
Yo.
And we are doing a little something pretty cool that I think you guys will dig. We are going to be region modding, or showing you how to region mod not only one Genesis, not only two Genesis, but three Genesi. So the main three Genesis consoles, Genesis and then I guess what? The 32X, no soldering. You guys know Noob Repair. We only do any kind of repairs or things that we're doing here don't involve soldering whatsoever.
It'll be mostly straightforward.
What we're going to be doing is doing hardware-only mods to the systems that are on. They're mostly on like a external level, for the most part.
Yeah, I guess so.
You know.
It's more modifying the case.
Right.
It's similar to the Super Nintendo, and we'll show this in, you know, as you go further into the video.
Right.
The cartridges are keyed a certain way, and that prevents a number of Japanese games from fitting into the American Sega Genesis or the European Mega Drive.
Right.
The cartridges on the American system and the European system are the same shape, so the same process applies to those, I believe.
Okay.
I don't remember if the doors are squared off or if they're the same shape as the Genesis one.
Right.
But either way, our point of reference is the American consoles because we are in here, the US.
Yes. So, I guess we'll get started. So we're gonna go, I guess, with the easiest modification first, which is actually the Sega Genesis 3 model.
And we will get to that once we've got everything all set up.
So to first take a step back, we wanted to just mention that a true console region mod for the Genesis involves changing out jumpers. It's not quite the same as the Super Nintendo modification. There are certain limitations of the Sega Genesis when it comes to playing Mega Drive games, either PAL regions or Japanese regions. So you may have to change out jumpers, change around the circuit board, like you may have to adjust things slightly.
Basically, since we're trying to show you how to do this without having to worry about soldering, we're going to show you how to modify the cartridge port on the systems,
right,
so that you can play the Japanese games because they are a different shape.
So they'll fit into the system. So most games will work, but there are, what, about 200 that will not work without...
Yeah, there's a portion of the Japanese library that needs to see a Japanese Mega Drive in order for it to actually load. Otherwise, you'll get a message on the screen.
Right.
There are some ways around that as well without having to modify it. But
yeah,
yes.
we'll get to that. So, we're going to start off with the Sega Genesis 3 model. And I have a game here that is a Japanese game, so we're going to go ahead and do the hardware region mod, as we said, right now. You guys ready for this?
Done.
Done. It doesn't need any modification, actually. The Sega Genesis 3 is already region unlocked in terms of the carts fitting into the system.
Yeah.
So you are good to go if you buy a Genesis 3. Really, if you're just looking to have an easy console so that you don't have to do any modification on the actual body of the console, this is probably your best bet. So.
And it's not a bad system.
One and done.
Basically, it's not a bad system either. A lot of people say, oh, well, it doesn't work with the 32X or the Sega CD.
Right.
A lot of people out there, maybe they don't care.
Maybe they just want a Genesis just to have a Genesis.
The only downside, really, to this machine is that most of the ones you're going to find are mono audio. It does not have stereo audio.
Right.
Allegedly, the earliest run of the Genesis 3 had stereo audio, but in my time, you know, collecting all different random Sega stuff, I have yet to come across one, so keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it is not a clone system. It does have the full Genesis.
It was produced by Majesco, though, right?
Well, Majesco sort of distributed it and funded it, but when you open it up, if you look at the circuit board, it's all Sega chips on it. So it is a true Genesis. It's not like a clone system or anything like that.
Right. Okay, all right. So let's move into the next one. Again, we're going from easiest to hardest, so let's jump into the next one.
So the first thing I want to show you is what the edge of a European Mega Drive and American Sega Genesis cartridge looks like. They both have the same shell.
Same style, yeah.
Yes. It has these two little notches on the corners here, and the front edge of the cartridge is rounded. Now, if you look at the Japanese cartridge, and let me not do three at once. The circuit board is exactly the same, but the squared off portion is a little narrower than that notch, and it's got these weird sort of like bumps on the side of it. I don't know. Personally, I think the cartridges kind of look like children's toys. I think they look kind of silly.
Yeah, I'm a bigger fan of the American Impal shell.
Also, I'm a bigger fan of the American Super Nintendo.
Yes, yes, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yes, yes, yeah. There's a big point of contention with some people on that. So, overall, they're not much different size and shape-wise, but the curvature of this edge is just enough that it will not fit into a standard Sega Genesis cartridge slot. Now, if you look, it's got that groove, it's got that notch there and there, and it's got the same curve that mates with the American cartridge. Obviously, the American cartridge will fit right in, no issue. When you try to put the Japanese cartridge in, let's see if we get a good angle here.
It hits right there.
Japanese Mega Drive, the cartridge slot is a perfect rectangle. It doesn't have anything to key the cartridge in.
Right.
They just assume that people were smart enough to put it in with the label facing them and call it a day.
Right.
When we start cutting these, we're gonna have to cut out not only that little notch in the corner,
but also right there.
Yeah.
Right.
You can either square that corner, the rounded edge off, or you can just open it up a little bit more. And as we go through these, you know, I'll do one and then I'll do one way and then I'll do one the other.
Right. In order to modify the hardware for the outer shell on the 32X Genesis, whatever you're working with today, you're only going to need two things, and that is one, it's like a hobby blade or a hobby knife, and then just like a Phillips head screwdriver. So that's really it.
So the reason the 32X is next in the list of, you know, easiest to most difficult, most difficult, is because the cartridge slot is not, you know, as much of a bear as, say, the Model 1 or the Model 2. And I'll show you the cartridges so that you can see what I'm talking about here.
If you look right here, these are the lips.
Yeah, those are the same keyed tabs, but you don't need to modify the front half of the cartridge.
So this
slot.
part is good.
Yeah,
right.
so I'll show you why. Go ahead and set that down. So again, you are familiar now at this point the difference between the Genesis cartridge and the Japanese cartridge.
Right.
Let's compare the Genesis with the 32X cartridge.
Now, it's a lot more square, there's more room.
Well, it's not that it's more square, it's wider. So the circuit board is the exact same length and the back side is the same, the keys on the back are the same, but because the cartridge is about like, I'd say 1/8 of an inch wider on each edge, it makes this, the slope of this cartridge, or the slope of the cartridge case right here, extend out further. And
you could also note that these have been filled in as well as far as the differences go.
Yeah, it doesn't
really
make too much
necessarily
of
make a difference.
But the reason they made the cartridge bigger was so that you can't fit it in a normal Genesis.
Right.
It's just wide enough that it won't fit in.
And what if you try to plug it in? What happens if you try to play it? It won't work?
If I recall, nothing really. I don't know if I ever toyed around with it.
Okay.
I do remember renting a 32X game from Blockbuster with a friend of mine back in the day.
Before you had a 32X?
Well, I tried to explain to him, I was like, Billy, I don't think it's really going to work.
Oh, Billy.
And but we tried it anyway, and then it didn't fit in, and we went back to Blockbuster and cried, and they changed it for us.
Right.
So, with the 32X, you know, obviously you can play Genesis games, but like I said, all you really need to do is deal with those tabs. But since, if you notice, the tabs are so much wider than the tabs on the regular Genesis, you don't have to cut the whole tab off. If you
just a little bit of a...
Yeah, if you just cut that in half, or even just a slight little nick.
Just a corner, right.
You know, you'll be good. I have another 32X here that I've already modified, and you can see I've taken the tabs off entirely. If you wanted to, again, you could just hold this one like this and very carefully cut it out like that. I will open the system up, though, so that you can see the process if you want to be more careful with it and not slice your finger off. So, it's very easy to open up. Like we said, you only need the screwdriver and the utility knife. There are 4 screws on the back of the 32X. I don't know what gives you the best lighting here.
Here, we'll showcase the screws. So the screws are there, there, and there. 4 easy screws to get out. That's what she said.
Oof. So now that we've got the screws to get the top of the case off, we have the two halves apart. I forget if there's any actual circuit board modification you need to do if you wanted to, say, play a Japanese 32X game, or if a Japanese Genesis game has any effect when it's played through a 32X. I'd say I'm 95% confident it doesn't. I think this is mostly a dummy unit, and it goes based on what the region of the console it's plugged into is. Right. But be aware, you know, there could be extra steps involved. But as far as modding the case itself, which again will let you play any of the Japanese Mega Drive games that do not have region lock encoding in the
actual game itself, right?
So after you've gotten that off, you still need to take this little guide out, and similar to the Super Nintendo, it's sort of like a collar that keeps the cartridge.
It's got 3 screws, so we've got 1 screw there, 1 screw there, 1 screw there.
Yeah. So it basically guides the cartridge in and prevents any dust and dirt and filth from splattering all around inside if you should happen to...
You know, if you're drinking an entire root beer, like a 2-liter bottle of root beer...
and you just fumble it.
And you're just, you know, going to put a card in and you lazily flumble it. Flumble it.
Yo, I flumble things all the time.
Gross.
Don't tell anyone. So here is the actual... you know, flap mechanism for the system. You can see that it's sort of got you got the light on it here. It's got a raised edge, and that's what comes up and you know, sits flush when this is actually on the shell of the case. So here now is
that's
the case.
What we're actually going to be modifying. So these tabs right here, this one and that one.
Okay, so you could also use a Dremel. You could also use a file to cut the tabs down. I'm using a utility knife just because I've done this enough and I've used, you know, tools like this enough that I'm relatively proficient in it. When you cut it, your guide is basically the back edge of the cartridge slot itself. You can see that this is technically a full rectangle, which, again, I assume that's what it might look like on a Japanese system in general. But all you need to do is cut these 2 tabs out. Now, it's up to you if you want to cut it just in half and have just enough room for the Japanese cartridge to sit in, or just cut it off entirely for aesthetic purposes. And all you do is carefully put pressure on it. Now, this is a sharp, fresh blade, and it is best to use a sharp blade. Granted, there's a possibility of slipping and slicing the machine up, or slicing a finger off.
You just have to be careful.
Yeah, if you use a dull blade, what's going to happen is it's going to be harder to drag through the plastic and worry it, so you're going to have to put more force. So chances are it's more likely that you're going to accidentally slip.
Yeah, or you can crack the outer shell. Like,
yeah, if you're pushing too hard. I hadn't even thought of that. So I'm just cutting it in half, so that you can see that you don't have to carve out that whole piece of plastic if you want to do it as simple and quick as possible. Again, the more you end up trying to cut, the more likely it is that you might make a mistake. So after you saw how I cut it, I just sort of wriggled the knife that way until I got halfway down. Now, come back. I'm going to do essentially the same thing. I hope you can see. You got it in the shot? My hand is probably blocking this, but it's the same process. I'm just putting pressure on the blade and wriggling it down towards the edge and the end of the last cut. You can see it's not straight. I can straighten that out later, but the tab has now come off. I'll go over to the other side. Now the other side I will cut off entirely. And then when we put the cartridge back into the slot, you can see the proximity of the tab to the curvature of the cart. Typically, oh my gosh, it's sliced right through it. I almost don't even need to clean that up. And that's basically it. It's sliced right off without much effort. I won't put the cartridge guide back on just because we don't need it for a simple example. Now that the case is on, you can see that the Japanese cartridge fits in just fine. You can see what I meant about the front edge of the cartridge slot in the 32X accepting Japanese cartridges just fine. And you can see now that there's kind of a gaping hole there with that whole tab removed. Whereas if you go over here to the other side, this sort of just fills it in a little bit. So it's entirely up to you.
Yeah, if you want to make it so that there's a little bit extra there just for extra protection, you don't have to cut the whole tab, just cut half of it. But if you just want to get rid of it without needing to worry about it, then you just remove the whole tab. Either way.
And I'm not gonna secure this on here, but I'm sure. Come on. I'm sure with it just staying where it is, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
You can see what it looks like I showed you on the other system. Once these are reinstalled onto the top of the shell, there's the half tab and there's the whole tab missing. Thankfully, the actual flaps themselves are full rectangle, so they'll still keep, you know, the majority of the dust from falling into the system. But now your 32X will take Japanese cartridges without much fuss. So once you've got the collar for the cartridge installed, just slip the top half of the case back on and put all the other screws back in where they belong.
Alright guys, so that's going to do it for the 32X and the Sega Genesis Model 3.
That Model 3 was tough.
Yeah, I know, right? Brutal. Region outer shell modification to region mod your system. The next episode of Noob Repair will be Sega Genesis Model 1 and Model 2.
Stay tuned.